In relation to this recent fighting, Amnesty International has called on the United Nations to immediately disclose the number of civilian casualties, as it is estimated that an enormous number of civilians were killed at the end of the conflict. We have received consistent testimony indicating that war crimes were committed by both sides of this conflict, and it's vital that there is an independent international investigation. Amnesty International released a report in June this year called 20 Years of Make-Believe, which documents some of the lack of independence in the most recent Commission of Inquiry in Sri Lanka. And it is this lack of domestic judicial mechanisms to investigate which is why Amnesty is calling for an independent international Commission of Inquiry. The reports of high civilian casualties underscores the need for this investigation. In March and April, I spoke to some of the doctors who were inside the zone who were treating patients in the makeshift hospitals, and I'm sure that many of you are very familiar with the case of the 5 doctors who were taken when they emerged from the Vani, initially actually taken incommunicado by the security forces at Omantai checkpoint, and then ended up officially in custody in Colombo. Those doctors have now been compelled to recant the descriptions of those civilian casualties, but I would say that their reports make the issue of investigation all the more important. I also have spoken to a number of relatives who have subsequently come out of the no-fly zone, actually left the camps in Sri Lanka, and are now living in parts of Europe. And some of those relatives describe the very horrifying scenes of that final months of the conflict, where literally people were hiding in bunkers as shells rained down on them. And I think this is what makes it vital that the United Nations do everything it can to establish the truth about the bloodbath that happened in Sri Lanka in these final months. And yet the UN has been weak. On the 22nd of May, the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva adopted a resolution that basically ignored the plight of the 250,000 civilians now confined in de facto detention camps run by the Sri Lankan military. The resolution failed to call for a fact-finding mission to inquire into these serious allegations. From Amnesty's point of view, the Human Rights Council's decision not to call for specific measures to civilians and the displaced makes a mockery of the Human Rights Council. But it certainly doesn't mean an end to the international community's obligations to respond to this ongoing crisis. Amnesty acknowledges the important role that the international community can play in Sri Lanka. There's an enormous amount of reconstruction that needs to occur. People need humanitarian assistance. They need support with returning home. These efforts, however, must be accompanied by specific measures to ensure respect for human rights, and we're urging all donors to Sri Lanka to ensure that the aid they give to Sri Lanka is in line with the guiding principles on displacement. In response to this current crisis, Amnesty has launched a campaign called Unlock the Camps. We have a briefing paper, and I left copies of this at the reception. You might be able to collect a copy when you leave. We've also launched a global action. This is online, and you can take action via Facebook, but also through more traditional Amnesty petitions. And over 30,000 people worldwide have now taken action. We have 4 key messages in our campaign. The first and most important is the issue of liberty and freedom of movement. This applies both with regard to the right of internally displaced people to leave the camp and the freedom to choose their residence and freely move in and out of the camps. There should also be systematic and transparent registration for each displaced person. The ICPPR states that every human being has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. And yet at present, the displaced in Sri Lanka do not have this recognition. They are not being consulted by the government about plans for their return, and this is simply deepening their anxiety and worrying them about what is going to happen next. Then, civilian administration and humanitarian access to the camps is key. The government must ensure that these camps are of a civilian nature. We have reports from church groups and women's groups who've been able to visit the camps that women in particular are very vulnerable to a militarised camps. And while the blackout of information about what's happening in the camps means that it's very challenging to corroborate some of the reports of violations, gender-based violence in a military setting is clearly a huge concern. Another area which is of huge worry to many of the relatives of people inside the camps is the issue of family reunification. Many people report that when they came out of the bunny and they went through the screening at Omantai checkpoint, many people were separated from each other. So you actually have a situation where there are many people living inside the camps, families who are separated from one another. And relatives have described to me how they have sent dozens of letters to the government authorities asking for information about their family members, trying to contact the security forces in order to locate their loved ones. But in a context where the International Committee of the Red Cross is barred access inside the camps, it means that the normal process of family reunification and tracking that an organisation like the Red Cross could offer is not able to happen, and that is a huge issue. In terms of what Amnesty has been doing on this crisis, we have been applying pressure to the Sri Lankan government, the United Nations, the British government, as well as other governments, to push for the release of people in the camps. As I mentioned, there are copies of our briefing paper at the back, and you can find updates of our campaign on the website. Public pressure is the greatest weapon against impunity, and I would urge all of you to take action today, calling for an immediate end to restrictions on freedom of movement. The displaced themselves say that if they were released, they would be able to sustain themselves. There are a range of options on the table, including living with host families. Walter Kalin has also suggested a range of options to the government in his press statement today, including transitional sites where people can be fast-tracked for returns. We can't turn back the clock on the terrible events that happened in the final months of the war. What we can do is to raise questions on where Sri Lanka is going and to push for accountability. And to this end, I would encourage you to write to the President of Sri Lanka expressing concern for the plight of internally displaced people. I have with me copies of a petition that Amnesty members are sending to the government of Sri Lanka, and I will leave the petitions up here for people to sign at the end of this meeting. I'd very much urge you to do that. I mean, Sri Lanka is a very challenging environment. The human rights is actually, I think, deteriorating post-conflict, not improving. We'll hear from other speakers about issues of the silencing of dissent and other human rights concerns. But what we can do today is to sign a petition and raise public awareness. For too many years, Sri Lanka has been a forgotten conflict, and it's very important to keep the spotlight on what's happening in Sri Lanka today. So thank you.